Most people think they know exactly how the First World War began. A student named Gavrilo Princip fires 2 shots in Sarajevo, an heir to a throne dies in the street, and within weeks the continent is at war. It's the version taught in almost every classroom on Earth, and it's the version that fits neatly into a single paragraph of a textbook. There's only one problem. It's barely half the story, and it may be the least important half. Because here's what that tidy version leaves out. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand didn't ignite a peaceful continent. It struck a match in a room that had been quietly filling with gas for almost half a century. The real question was never who fired the shot. It's who spent 40 years building the conditions that made a shot fatal to an entire civilization. And when you follow the shipping contracts, the loan agreements, the mining concessions, and the boardroom minutes, you find something far more unsettling than a story about tangled alliances and a reckless assassin. This isn't really a story about a dead archduke, or even proud empires bumping into each other by accident. It's a story about capital, about who would control the raw materials, the shipping lanes, and the credit lines that would define the next 100 years. It's about factories that needed customers, banks that needed borrowers, and generals who needed an excuse. That's the story textbooks rush past, and it's the one we're going to slow down and actually tell. So let's not start in Sarajevo in 1914. Let's start decades earlier, in the counting houses and steel mills where the real preconditions for catastrophe were quietly assembled. To understand how Europe stumbled into the deadliest conflict humanity had yet produced, you first have to understand what the continent looked like economically, not just on a map, but on a ledger. The final third of the 19th century was an era of staggering industrial acceleration. Germany, unified in 1871 after defeating France, transformed within a single generation from a patchwork of farming states into the continent's most formidable manufacturing power. By the early 1910s, German steel output had overtaken Britain, France, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire combined. Its chemical and electrical industries were the most advanced in the world, and its population had nearly doubled since unification, feeding an enormous domestic appetite for goods, credit, and eventually, markets abroad. Britain, meanwhile, was the established power watching its lead evaporate. For a century, Britain had been the unchallenged industrial center of the planet. Its navy patrolled every ocean, its currency underwrote global trade, and the City of London effectively ran the plumbing of the world economy. But that dominance was thinning. In the early 1870s, Britain had produced roughly a third of the planet's manufactured goods. By the years just before the war, that share had fallen dramatically while Germany's climbed to nearly match it. This wasn't an abstract statistic. It was read in London as a threat to the 2 pillars holding up the entire British imperial system: naval supremacy and financial dominance. If Germany could challenge either one, the empire's foundation would start to crack. The man who decided to test both pillars was Kaiser Wilhelm II. When he inherited the German throne in 1888, he inherited a country carefully steered by his predecessor, Otto von Bismarck, who understood something crucial about Germany's position. Sandwiched between France and Russia, an overly aggressive Germany would invite encirclement. Bismarck's foreign policy had been one of caution, managing rivalries rather than provoking them, and deliberately staying out of the colonial scramble consuming the rest of Europe. Wilhelm had none of that patience. Insecure and desperate for prestige, he dismissed Bismarck within 2 years and launched a doctrine known as Weltpolitik, or world policy. This wasn't simply a change in tone. It was a total reorientation of German ambition. Germany would no longer content itself as a regional continental power. It would demand overseas colonies, build a battle fleet capable of rivaling the Royal Navy, and insist on what Wilhelm called its place in the sun. And here is where the conventional story starts to mislead people. Most retellings frame Weltpolitik as evidence of an inherently militaristic German character, some kind of Prussian aggression baked into the national psyche. That framing skips the economic engine underneath it. Weltpolitik wasn't primarily a military project. It was, first and foremost, a commercial one. Germany's booming factories needed raw materials it didn't possess domestically. Its swelling population needed export markets. And its bankers, sitting on enormous reserves of capital, needed somewhere profitable to put that money. The problem was that the colonial world, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, had already been divided up by Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Germany had arrived at the imperial banquet after most of the food was claimed. The British economist John Atkinson Hobson diagnosed exactly this dynamic in a widely read 1902 study that would later shape thinkers as different as Vladimir Lenin and John Maynard Keynes. Hobson argued that the era's imperial expansion wasn't driven by patriotism or a civilizing mission, however much politicians dressed it up that way. It was driven by surplus capital. As industrialized economies matured, returns available at home began to shrink, and investors went hunting for new frontiers where money could be put to work at higher yields. Colonies supplied exactly that: captive labor, captive resources, and captive consumers with nowhere else to buy from. Hobson was writing primarily about Britain, but his logic applied with even sharper force to a Germany shut out of the game entirely. German financial institutions, chief among them a handful of enormous universal banks, were sitting on capital reserves that needed an outlet, and the single most ambitious outlet they found was a railway. If you've only ever heard one or two causes of the First World War in school, they were probably the alliance system and the naval arms race. Almost nobody is taught about the Baghdad Railway, and that omission is a convenient one, because the railway reveals something the standard story would rather not dwell on, that this conflict was, in no small part, about oil, trade corridors, and the future shape of empire. The project traces back to 1888, the very year Wilhelm II took the throne, when a German banking consortium secured Ottoman approval to build a rail line linking Constantinople to the Anatolian interior. On its face, a modest commercial venture, but the ambition behind it was continental in scale. Eventually link Berlin all the way through the Balkans, across Anatolia, down through Mesopotamia, and finally to a Persian Gulf port near Basra. Picture what that meant in practice. An unbroken overland rail corridor connecting industrial Germany directly to the Persian Gulf, bypassing the Suez Canal entirely, a canal Britain had controlled since the 1870s through a decisive share purchase financed by one of Europe's most powerful banking families. Such a railway would give Germany direct overland access to Middle Eastern markets and, crucially, to oil fields only just being discovered. In 1908, petroleum was struck in southwestern Persia, one of the first major oil finds in the region, and it sent a jolt through every European capital. Britain had already begun converting the Royal Navy's fuel supply from coal to oil, a transition championed by the man then in charge of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil would control the fuel supply of the modern battleship, the modern army, and modern industry itself. A new Anglo-Persian oil venture was formed in 1909, with the British government taking a controlling stake mere weeks before war broke out in 1914. The oil-rich territory around Mosul and Kirkuk remained contested, and a completed German railway threatened to put Berlin in pole position to claim it. London wasn't alone in its alarm. St. Petersburg viewed the railway as a dagger aimed at Russia's southern flank in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Paris, holding enormous financial stakes in both the Ottoman Empire and the Russian state, saw it as a direct threat to a balance of power it had spent decades cultivating. By 1914, French investors held somewhere near 20 billion francs in Russian government bonds, making France by far the largest external creditor, keeping the Russian treasury afloat, a financial entanglement so deep that France's own economic health was tied directly to Russia, surviving as a great power. So when historians describe the war as caused by a web of alliances, they aren't wrong exactly. They're just describing the surface symptom rather than the underlying condition. Those alliances weren't abstract handshake agreements between gentlemen in uniform. They were backed by billions in loans, bond purchases, and trade arrangements. The Entente between Britain, France, and Russia functioned as much as a financial bloc as a military one, and the rival alliance binding Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy was, in part, an attempt to build a competing economic sphere large enough to stand against it. Now, let's talk about something the standard telling flattens, the arms race. Most classrooms present the pre-war buildup as national pride, countries racing to outbuild their neighbors. True as far as it goes, but it leaves out the industrialists getting rich off every escalation. The quarter century before 1914 was, in the language of arms industry historians, a golden age of expansion, and a handful of private firms sat at the center of it. Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth in Britain, Krupp, the largest weapons manufacturer on the planet, in Germany, and Schneider-Creusot in France. And here's the uncomfortable part. These companies weren't loyal to a single flag. They sold to whoever could pay. Krupp, the crown jewel of German heavy industry, supplied artillery not only to Berlin but to Belgium, the Netherlands, Romania, the Ottoman Empire, and even Russia, a country Germany would eventually be fighting. Vickers sold warships and armaments to Japan, Brazil, Turkey, and several nations that would later find themselves opposite Britain on a battlefield. Armstrong built warships for the Japanese fleet later used in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, a conflict that reshuffled the balance of power in Asia and rippled outward into the instability that helped set the stage for 1914. None of this happened in secret. Arms manufacturing was one of the most lucrative sectors in Europe, and the firms behind it wielded enormous political influence. Krupp's relationship with the German state was so close, it functioned almost like an unofficial arm of government, and its longtime head was a personal friend of the Kaiser, who delivered a eulogy at his funeral in 1902. The arms race also had a self-perpetuating engine. Manufacturers were happy to keep running. When Britain launched a revolutionary new class of battleship in 1906, instantly making every existing warship obsolete, it set off a continent-wide construction frenzy. Germany answered with its own program. France, Russia, Italy, Austria, Hungary, even smaller states scrambled to acquire the new class of ship. Between 1906 and the outbreak of war, Britain launched roughly 19 of these dreadnoughts alongside 9 battlecruisers. Germany answered with 13 dreadnoughts and 5 battlecruisers of its own. Each new hull justified the next, and each generated enormous profits for the steel mills and shipyards that built it. Naval expansion acts passed in London and Berlin were, in practical terms, subsidy programs for the private firms building the fleets. The buildup wasn't limited to the sea. On land, standing armies swelled at an extraordinary rate. Germany's peacetime army roughly doubled between 1870 and the years just before the war, with the capacity to mobilize millions more. France, with a smaller population, still maintained an army approaching 750,000 men. Russia fielded the largest standing force in the world, well over 1 million soldiers even in peacetime. These armies were equipped with weapons of unprecedented lethality, rapid-fire machine guns, artillery of extraordinary range, and chemical research already well advanced in labs on both sides of the Rhine. The killing machinery was assembled and waiting. All it needed was a pretext. This is where the historical debate gets genuinely contentious. For years, after the guns fell silent, the question of blame had a simple official answer. Germany did it. That was the position baked into the post-war peace settlement, whose infamous war guilt clause forced Germany to accept sole responsibility and pay ruinous reparations. The reasoning seemed straightforward. Germany had given Austria-Hungary an unconditional pledge of support after the assassination, declared war first on both Russia and France, and marched through neutral Belgium. Case closed, or so it seemed. But in the years that followed, a wave of revisionist historians, some quietly supported by the German government itself, began chipping away at that verdict. They pointed to Russia's early mobilization, France's decades-old hunger for revenge after 1871, and Britain's failure to send an unambiguous signal it would intervene. They argued the conflict was less a deliberate plot than a catastrophic diplomatic accident, every great power sharing the blame more or less equally. A former British Prime Minister described it memorably as Europe having somehow slithered into the abyss. For decades, that softer narrative became dominant. It was comfortable. It let every capital off the hook. Then, in 1961, German historian Fritz Fischer detonated that comfortable consensus. Drawing on previously unexamined German state archives, Fischer argued Germany hadn't stumbled into this war at all. It had actively courted it. His central evidence was a memorandum drafted by the German Chancellor weeks after fighting began, laying out sweeping war aims, annexing Luxembourg and portions of Belgium and France, creating a German-dominated customs union spanning much of the continent, seizing French colonial territory in Africa, and permanently weakening France so it could never again rise as a rival power. These weren't goals improvised in the euphoria of early victories, Fischer argued. They were the logical endpoint of decades of expansionist thinking already circulating among Germany's political, military, and industrial elite. The backlash inside Germany was fierce. Respected conservative historians accused Fischer of national betrayal. Officials reportedly tried to block him from traveling abroad to present his findings. But the work couldn't be suppressed, and it opened a floodgate of scholarship exposing how deliberately Germany's industrial, military, and political classes had pushed toward confrontation. This is exactly where Fischer's thesis connects back to the economic story, because when you trace who was actually agitating for war inside Germany, the fingerprints of capital are everywhere. Nationalist pressure groups pushing aggressive expansion were bankrolled by industrialists and landowners who stood to profit from new territory. Krupp had obvious stakes in prolonged conflict. The banking houses financing the Baghdad Railway wanted the Ottoman Empire locked inside Germany's economic orbit. Landed aristocrats in the East wanted fresh territory to shore up their fading position. A later generation of historians argued Weltpolitik had, by 1914, essentially failed on its own terms, securing neither the colonies nor the markets German industry craved, while succeeding brilliantly at alarming every rival power into an opposing coalition. Germany's leadership found itself trapped by its own rhetoric, promising its citizens a global empire just as the age of open colonial expansion was closing. When the Balkan crisis erupted in summer 1914, that trap didn't look like a disaster to some in Berlin. It looked like a last window of opportunity. But Fischer's thesis, groundbreaking as it was, isn't the entire picture, and treating Germany as the sole author of the catastrophe is nearly as reductive as spreading the blame so thin nobody is responsible. This is the second major place the popular narrative goes wrong. Look closely at Russia's conduct during the July crisis, and you find a government behaving just as recklessly as Berlin's. Russia's decision to order general mobilization in late July 1914 was arguably the single most consequential military decision of the crisis, because it handed Germany exactly the nightmare its planners had spent a generation dreading, a simultaneous two-front war against both France and Russia. Germany's only operational war plan required a lightning strike through Belgium against France before pivoting east. Russian mobilization made German mobilization all but automatic, and a German advance through Belgium made British entry almost inevitable. Why did Russia move first? Partly solidarity with Serbia, partly fear that Austria-Hungary might crush the last independent Slavic state in the Balkans. But there's a less discussed financial dimension too. Russia was midway through an enormous military modernization program, funded substantially by those French loans, not scheduled to finish until 1917. German planners knew this timetable and feared waiting even a few more years would leave Russia too formidable to defeat. That fear produced its own dark logic. Strike now before the balance shifts permanently against you. Then there's France, often cast as the reluctant ally dragged into war purely out of loyalty to Russia. The record tells a different story. The French president, who traveled to meet the Tsar in the final weeks of July 1914, appears to have actively encouraged Russia to hold firm against Austria-Hungary rather than seek compromise. French military doctrine, particularly its aggressive offensive war plan, had been shaped for 4 decades by a burning desire to reclaim the territories lost to Germany in 1871. France didn't stumble into this war. It had been rehearsing for it, psychologically and militarily, for a generation. And then there's Britain, so often portrayed as the reluctant defender of small nations entering the war purely to uphold Belgian neutrality. That framing undersells the calculation involved. Britain's decision to fight was fundamentally about preserving the balance of power on the continent. A German victory over both France and Russia would have produced a single dominant power controlling the Channel coastline, commanding continental trade, and possessing a navy potentially capable of challenging British supremacy at sea. Britain went to war because a Europe dominated by Berlin was incompatible with its commercial and imperial interests. The Foreign Secretary understood this perfectly well, but also understood that neither Parliament nor the public would rally behind a war fought openly for commercial advantage. Belgium's invasion supplied the moral clarity his cabinet needed. The violation was real and a genuine outrage. But in the cold arithmetic of statecraft, it was also, conveniently, exactly the pretext London required. Which brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion that both the blame Germany camp and the blame everyone equally camp tend to obscure. The First World War wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the product of a lone villain either. It was the output of a global economic system that had been quietly manufacturing dangerous pressure for decades. The scramble for colonies, the arms race, competition over raw materials and export markets, the deep entanglement of finance with foreign policy, and an industrial capitalism whose appetite for growth had no ceiling. These weren't background conditions. They were the forces that made war not merely possible, but, in the calculations of the men making the actual decisions, rational. Some historians go further, arguing domestic political pressure inside each great power played its own quiet role. Foreign policy, in this reading, becomes an extension of internal social conflict, a rising industrial middle class, a declining landed aristocracy, and a restless working class, all pulling governments in different directions, or functioned as a pressure valve, uniting a fractured society against an external enemy rather than letting internal tensions boil over. This wasn't unique to Germany. Britain was consumed by labor unrest, the Irish question, and the suffrage movement. France was divided by the aftershocks of the Dreyfus affair. Russia was haunted by the failed 1905 revolution. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating under its own ethnic patchwork. In every capital, influential voices argued war would forge unity and silence dissent. And underneath all of it, always, there was money. Arms manufacturers profiting from every fresh round of escalation, banks financing the loans that paid for military expansion, industrialists hunting for colonies to supply raw materials and captive customers, railway barons connecting mines to ports and factories to front lines, shipping magnates, steel producers, insurance underwriters covering it all. The war wasn't fought purely for their benefit, but it was fought inside a world they had helped design, one where economic rivalry between great powers had come to be treated as a zero-sum contest, and where the final arbiter of economic disputes was ultimately military force. One influential attempt to move past the simple blame game came from an Australian historian whose 2012 study framed European leaders not as villains, but as men acting on incomplete information and catastrophic miscalculation, stumbling toward catastrophe with their eyes half open rather than deliberately choosing it. That framing is compelling, but critics push back, arguing it goes too far toward letting everyone off the hook, and risks obscuring the very real, deliberate choices made in Berlin and Vienna to pursue confrontation over compromise. Which brings us, I think, to the single most important lesson in this debate. There is no single clean version of how the First World War began. The truth is layered, contradictory, and deeply uncomfortable to sit with. Germany bears a disproportionate share of responsibility. The documentary evidence for that is overwhelming, but Germany didn't act in a vacuum. It acted inside a system that rewarded aggression, incentivized competition, and made war feel like the logical continuation of economic policy by other means. The men making these decisions in the summer of 1914 weren't fools, and they weren't sleepwalking in any literal sense. They were behaving rationally within a framework built brick by the interplay of industrial capitalism, imperial rivalry, and great power politics. The tragedy isn't that they failed to see where their choices were leading. The tragedy is that many saw it with perfect clarity and proceeded anyway, because within the logic of that system, it made a kind of terrible sense. When the fighting finally stopped in November 1918, the world that emerged was almost unrecognizable from the one that had entered it. 4 empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had collapsed entirely. Close to 20 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, were dead, with tens of millions more wounded. The financial toll was staggering. Britain alone spent an amount that took decades to repay and permanently reshaped its position in the global financial order. France lost a significant share of its young male population. Germany was saddled with reparations so punishing they helped poison European politics for a generation, laying groundwork for an even worse conflict 20 years later. And the arms manufacturers, the banking houses, the shipping conglomerates, they mostly survived intact. The system that generated the conditions for catastrophe wasn't dismantled. It was restructured, rebranded, and quietly left standing to help build the next one. So the real origin story of the First World War isn't really about a single bullet fired on a street corner in Sarajevo. It isn't primarily about interlocking alliances or mobilization schedules, though those things were real and they mattered. It's a story about what happens when economic competition among great powers accelerates without meaningful restraint, when the interests of capital fuse with the interests of the state, and when the machinery of war becomes so profitable that peace starts to look to some very powerful people like an obstacle to progress. That story didn't end with the armistice in 1918. It continued through the interwar years, through an even larger war 2 decades later, through the long standoff of the Cold War, and it continues today in different forms and different theaters, running on much the same underlying logic. So the next time someone tells you the First World War began with an assassination in Sarajevo, remember this. The assassination was real. The alliance treaties were real. The mobilization timetables were real. None of that explains why tens of millions of men were sent to fight a war almost none of them actually wanted. To understand that, you have to follow the money. Ask who financed the railways, who profited from every new warship, who carved up the colonial map, and who ultimately decided the question of who would dominate the coming century was worth settling with a generation's worth of blood. That's what the standard version gets wrong, not the basic facts, but the emphasis. It tells you the what and the how in exhaustive detail, but rarely lingers on the why. And the why, as it so often is, comes down to money. If this reframed how you think about the true causes of the First World War, consider subscribing for more deep dives like this one. Drop a comment letting me know which part surprised you the most. I read every single one. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, check out the related video on your screen right now. See you there.